Welcome to the next lesson. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to define constraints, identify the implications of capacity constraints for organizations, and perform analyses that help manage constrained capacity. Now, let's start off with an example, and let's keep it nice and basic. Suppose that you own a business, and I'm going to keep things so general that we won't even name the products that you produce, other than A and B. Both products are produced using the same capacity. That essentially means that we can rely on contribution margin as a profitability measure. Because we're using the same capacity, the costs associated with that capacity aren't fluctuating depending on which product we produce or how much of it we would produce. So contribution margin, which is the difference between revenues and the costs that do change, or variable costs, is represented for each product. Product A is $3 per unit, and product B is $2 per unit. So suppose we know the contribution margin for each of our products. Again, $3 for A and $2 for B. And one very basic and almost insulting question is, which product would you prefer to sell? Now maybe there's some strategic issues associated with the different products, but let's assume all of that away and just focus on a profitability perspective. Well, the answer here very simply would be, I would rather produce and sell a unit of product A as opposed to product B. Product B is not all that bad, especially compared to doing nothing, but product A maximizes profitability over product B. Now, I asked that question for a very specific reason, and let's think about what that question is really implying. In the extreme, essentially you have a choice between selling one unit of A and one unit of B. Imagine the scenario where the customer comes in at the end of the day, the last day of the year, and they say, I need a unit of your product. So you essentially would shift them over to purchasing A as opposed to B. That means that we are constrained in terms of how much our market is demanding of us. This hypothetical customer wanted just one unit, and given that constraint, we would choose the most profitable unit. Now, we said the word constraint, and let's define that before we move on. Constraint is a limitation on the organization's ability to achieve its goals. That's very general. So let's talk about the types of constraints. As we had in our example, sometimes we have constraints in terms of demand. There's only so much money that's allocated to purchasing our product by the market. There's only so many customers, so much demand for the units that we produce. So demand, of course, can be constrained. But sometimes constraints occur inside of our organization, and we have supply or capacity constraints. Those are constraints that have to do with our internal operations. In those situations, there's plenty of demand for our product, but there's something about our ability to supply to that market. Now, let's think of some examples of supply-based constraints. Perhaps we only have so many employees working for us in a particular time period, and they only work so many hours in the day. So our labor force may be a constraint. People want more of our product, but we don't have enough labor at this point in time to produce that many units. Perhaps we have enough employees, but our factory is limited in terms of its size or the ability to run multiple machines. And so machine time may be a constraint. Perhaps we use raw materials that are precious or limited in terms of their supply. And so while we can produce as many units and sell them as we can, we run out of raw materials before we reach that level. And of course, there might be something about the supply channel or distribution that causes a constraint for us. So before we move on, let's make sure that we understand these very basic concepts.